somebody, no? Okay. My pleasure to introduce Roberto Barrios, whom you know very well already, but to tell a few details. He is, as you know very well, from the Department of Anthropology of the Southern Illinois University, with which we are very in close cooperation, and we have him already coming for the second time to teach for Kona students, and we hope to get him coming again and again. So this is a very important message, and we already started to negotiate about that. Second very important message is that he is who really studies anthropology of disasters and anthropology of risk for last 18 years. So he is expert of the experts in that field. He is extremely good in getting in touch with locals who have a long histories of suffering. This is extremely important for also Eastern Europeans who are in many ways, especially from post-socialist perspective or from post-socialist anthropology perspective, are looked upon as people of trauma, people of disasters in a sense of social suffering. So social suffering in Eastern Europe and sufferings studied by Roberto in North America could be in some sort of comparative perspective taken, but first and most important is that he has a first-hand knowledge, he has a extreme sensitive engagement into the field, and his methodology shows that, and his experience shows that. And on the top of it is his book, as you already seen, it's Governing Affect. Valdant Jaudulį, some sort of extreme engagement into emotional side of how to cope with disasters. So this is, I think, best of the best of anthropology, of applied anthropology, because of, let's say, from anthropology of medicine, from anthropology of other fields, emotions look like not very much studied. And here comes Roberto Barrios, who does that side of answer or response or sort of understanding how people do. And his recent project, NSF grant project, NSF means National Science Foundation, the most prestigious grant in the United States, is on Harvey, it's on Houston. It's about how the most recent hurricane, not much of net by, but responses to, and how people are answering to that. And this grant is from the University of Tennessee colleagues, and also his students are involved in this grant. And we hope probably for another book coming of that grant. So I hope you will deal a lot on that too. So
oh yes.
Floor is yours, please.
Well, thank you, Professor Trubrinskas, for the invitation to come to Lithuania, and thank you all for attending. So yes, it's been a wonderful 2 weeks, and I will miss it dearly when I leave. But hopefully, I'll come back, and it'll be more fun in Lithuania. So, speaking with Dr. Trubrinskas, he asked me to speak specifically to the topic of risk, and especially risk in its broad sense, right? In particularly the concept of risk society, familiarized or popularized by Beck. And so for me, this takes me a little bit out of my comfort zones, since I come from disaster anthropology, and disasters can be defined in a variety of ways, but sometimes in anthropology we specialize mostly on environmental related disasters and technological disasters. But disasters, first and foremost, a word that can be applied to many things, right? We can talk about economic disasters, and so the broad applicability of it. So my approach to risk was heavily influenced by looking at disasters that are, and this is the thing about anthropology, right? That in the anthropology of disasters, there's no such thing as a natural disaster. Disasters are socio-natural, for lack of a better word, right? The disasters do not occur in a nature that's bracketed off from society. It's about how our development practices, land use practices, enhance the materially destructive and socially disruptive capacities of geophysical phenomena that then bring about a disaster. And disaster can be defined as a particular, well, first of all, some people define it as a process, right? That it's not the event itself, but it's a long-standing process of how people have been related to an environment or perhaps an economy that creates certain conditions that then a particular catastrophic event takes place. They should not be confused with a disaster. You just have the catastrophic emergency event that becomes so overwhelming that it challenges the capacities of a particular society to respond to it. Otherwise, it's just an emergency, right? In an emergency happens, an accident occurs in the street, we have the established human, social structures, institutional structures to respond to it. We have ambulances, we have police departments, society does not become disrupted. But a disaster is categorized by this widespread disruption. So in that sense, certainly an economic recession like the one of 2008 can become a disaster. We have widespread disruption all over the world of economies, right, of people's livelihoods. And so, in a sense, this presentation is supports me, and that's just really good, because it's making me think in ways that I hadn't thought about before. It's making me consult literature that I hadn't consulted before, thinking about risk in the broader sense, and what is the anthropology of risk. And I want to see, because I'm an anthropologist who does believe in the power of ethnography, or in the importance of ethnography, then I want to see what does an ethnography of the recovery of the city of Houston after Hurricane Harvey, what does this kind of tell us and inform current ways of theorizing what risk is in this broad sense, right? So trying to think about risk in a broader sense, not just in terms of the risk of things like flooding or landslides, but thinking about multiple types of risk of things like nuclear power plant explosions, radioactive fallout, economic meltdowns. They're both meltdowns, right? Nuclear power plants and economic meltdowns. I wanted to start with a little video that maybe will help us think about what it means to think anthropologically about risk, and how does anthropology differ from other disciplines, and what does anthropology, its theories and methods tend to contribute to how we understand risk. And let's go back in time to 2004, when back in a simpler, kinder time, when we thought that Arnold Schwarzenegger being governor of California was itself outrageous, right? And now we have Trump, and it's even more outrageous. Things keep on getting more exciting and more exciting. I thought we had sound here.
But there's another way you can tell you're Republican. Your faith in free enterprise, faith in the resourcefulness of the American people, and faith in the U.S. economy. And to those critics who are so pessimistic about our economy, I say, don't be economic girly man.
So Cheney, Giuliani, everyone applauding, right? So it's really interesting. What is it? The weaving of narratives about risk-taking, right, and gender, and homophobia, all being seamlessly woven together by Arnold Schwarzenegger. And then when we look at something like the economic meltdown of 2008, it's the fact that what is being called here being economic girlyman would be, being an economic girlyman would be things like saying we should have certain regulations that govern how real estate finance is handled. In particularly making sure that we don't begin to do outrageous things with interest rates and debt that will eventually lead to people not being able to pay back their mortgages, and that will lead to a panic in Wall Street and people beginning to sell their stock, which is what a disaster is. That's being effeminate, right? That's not being a proper Republican. It's not being a proper American. But that's the thing, right? That when we think about things like financial crisis, right? That risk is a risk-taking behavior that's being promoted here, and it's not just being promoted by Arnold Schwarzenegger, right? That's a part of the narrative or the political philosophy of liberal economics in North America that are championed by people from both sides of the political spectrum, but to a great extent the Republican Party. That you must be this risk taker. And it's that taking of risks that eventually leads to this economic collapse. So the crisis is set on, right? But one of the problems with thinking about crisis is that often in the ways that we think about crisis is that we think about it ahistorically and atemporally, right? We're just in a crisis, but we don't even know why. And then hopefully we'll overcome the crisis. And then we go back to doing exactly the same things, taking exactly the same kinds of risks, and falling into the same narratives about risk that causes us to engage in that crisis. So I wanted to take some time to explore some of these ideas, how they actually bear out, and to look very superficially at the ways that anthropologists and other related social scientists have been thinking about risk, and particularly looking at the city of Houston. And here's Houston in the aftermath of Harvey, completely flooded, the floodplain of what is Buffalo Bayou leading to the city, flooding hundreds of thousands of properties and claiming about 89 lives and costing $160 billion in damages, at least of what's been tabulated so far. And also, as BT mentioned, my book, I have distributed copies via PDF to people, and I can leave some more copies for people who are interested in it, which is not necessarily directly related to what I'm talking about today, but if you're curious about my work, you can also look at that. But let's talk about what is risk. How do anthropologists, how do people in the social sciences think about it? So there's a whole field of thought. There's several terms that we're going to be throwing around here. We're going to be throwing around disaster, crisis, vulnerability, and how it relates to the concept of risk. And my disclaimer first and foremost is all these are words. And words can have different contexts. And people can give them different meanings. And words also have what we call semiotic slippage, that their meanings can creep and change slightly, right? So two people can use the same word and mean very different things. And my task as an anthropologist is not to fix the meaning of a word, to say this is what it means, but my task is to look at the variety of ways in which people use the terms and try to understand what's at stake between different usages, right? What's at risk in different usages. So there's certainly a big body of literature that's called vulnerability theory, within which risk is one of many concepts, including risk concepts like hazard, including concepts like vulnerability, including concepts like disaster. And some people within that field choose to define risk as the product of a particular equation. You have a hazard. A hazard can be something like a hurricane. A hazard can be something like a stock market crash, right? Or the hazard in the stock market crash might be it's the hazard that people might begin to sell too many of their shares, right? That's dangerous. But that's not risk in and of itself, right? A hurricane is not risk in and of itself. A hurricane must be compounded by this thing called vulnerability. And the concept of vulnerability, particularly in disaster studies, is that as human beings, there's a possibility of different ways of behaving in the world and of being in the world. So regulation might be one of them, right? In the advent of the stock market crash of 2008, there are people. Certain regulations were not existent that were allowing people in financial markets concerning mortgages to do all kinds of crazy things that were allowing them to charge all kinds of interest from people, bundle debts, sell them, make finance in all kinds of ways. And there were very few regulations or very few people, Federal Securities and Exchange Commission, looking over their shoulder saying, you know what you're doing is really risky. Like you know what you're doing that's really dangerous. You should stop that, right? And so those are the conditions that are characterized as vulnerability. In more environmental disaster studies, vulnerability might be the fact that if an earthquake can be a hazard, but if you are within a building that has seismic resistance construction techniques, then your vulnerability is very low, right? Because the hazard might present itself, but the building's not going to collapse and you're not going to die. But if you live in a society where there's a lot of corruption, and although we know, like this happened in China in the Wenchuan earthquake of 2008, where people within China had knowledge of seismic-resistant codes of how to build buildings that would not collapse, but people paid bribes, people dodged governmental regulations, and they built buildings that didn't actually collapse, right? And that's the vulnerability. The hazard with the earthquake, the vulnerability is what were people doing. In the same way, the hazard is that the hazard, and I'm trying to think about what the hazard of financial capital is, right? But the hazard of financial capital is that really it's when people panic in the stock market, that the stock market crashes, right? People are afraid that they're going to lose out on their investments, they begin to sell shares too quickly, the value of shares drops, the market loses value, the market collapses. And the vulnerability is, if you're not putting enough regulations in place to make sure that you close the market if people start selling too much, or that you make sure that the financial conditions don't present themselves that people want to sell their shares too quickly. That all leads to vulnerability, right? And what Arnold Schwarzenegger is calling being an economic girly man is being too scared about creating conditions of vulnerability, right? Just take away the regulations, right? And this begins with the presidency of Ronald Reagan, right? When Ronald Reagan begins to say, let's let the bull loose, the bull of Wall Street. Let's take the regulations that are constraining Wall Street, that are keeping finance capital from replicating itself. Let's take those regulations out, right? So something that is championed as a desirable state of affairs, as something that is bravery, masculinity, it's actually what may be engendering the conditions of vulnerability, right? And that creates the risk, the likelihood of something happening. So here's the interesting thing about risk is that the idea is that risk is something that can be calculated. And I want to try to engage in a conversation between the difference between risk and uncertainty, right? Because when you have uncertainty, perhaps you don't know. You just don't know. Whereas risk, there's more of a calculation. And this part applies particularly to disaster studies, where people do engage in calculations of what is the percentage likeliness that this particular place will flood in a particular amount of time. So here's a quote from a colleague of mine in Mexico who is fully invested within the vulnerability approach. He works in an institution where a lot of anthropologists work. He's not an anthropologist himself, he's a geographer, but he's a very well-known geographer who works on disaster risk reduction. And on one occasion, he made this statement. He said, el riesgo es único, and that means risk is singular. There is only one risk, and that's risk how I define it. And why did he say that? In what context did he say it? He said it in the context of a graduate student, Vicente Torres Cantú, whose work I'm thinking about right now and citing right now. So this is a North American case study about certain kinds of risk, right, and not necessarily environmental risk, although this looks like it's about environment. It's not. It's about politics. And she wanted to talk about the idea of political risk. And what she was looking at is, we're undergoing the process of climate change, right? And we need to imagine solutions to climate change in a warming Earth. And one of the ideas that people have is, we need renewable forms of energy, right? We need wind turbines, we need solar panels. Those all sound like great things that we all need, right? But and who could argue against sources of renewable energy? Who could say no to that, right? I mean, right now we're having this problem, right? That in Belarus they're building a nuclear power plant, they're building another one in Kaliningrad, right? And those forms of energy production are very risky, very dangerous. We don't want those, but wind turbines, good, right? But the truth is that when we as anthropologists begin to actually go and do ethnographies of things, like something that we couldn't possibly question and problematize, like installing wind turbines in Mexico, when you as an ethnographer actually go and see these projects out, you figure out that things are much more complex. So one of the problems is that the question about renewable sources of energy and renewable energy technologies is, where are they going to go? Where are we going to put them? For some people, these can become rather disruptive. For example, solar panels. Solar panels can increase the temperature because of the reflection that takes place, can increase the temperature of a particular site where they're placed. And this begins to dovetail with the idea of environmental justice and environmental injustice, that often these technologies, which are admittedly beneficial and desirable, but the question is, who's going to pay the cost of their implementation? And often it ends up being, that is, communities that are historically marginalized that end up being affected by it. So in the town where I live in Carbondale, for example, there's a plan right now to put in, or there's a desire to put in a whole collection of solar panels. But the problem is that they're not going to put them where the professors live. They're not going to put them in a nice part of town. They want to put them in a part of town, which is, like most places in the United States, is a town where people are segregated in all kinds of unofficial ways. And there are particular parts of town where working class and low middle class African American people live, which is the Northeast Quadrant, and that's where they want to put the solar panels. Not only do they want to put them there, but they also want to put them in a site where there was a previous toxic waste site. And so there's toxins in the soil, and the concern of local residents is that installing the panels is also going to kick up all kinds of toxins that are going to affect them. So there's tremendous opposition on the part of local residents. And so here's the interesting thing, right? Recently I was invited to comment on this, and the majority of the people who support the installation of the solar panels are people who I would identify as predominantly white, college-educated, environmentalist, progressives, but they are themselves creating a tension with people of town who self-identify as African American, working class, right? And there's a real disjuncture there between how the progressive, liberal, highly college-educated Euro-American elites imagine what the solution is, and then not necessarily taking into consideration all these issues of inequity, right? And so in this particular instance, we're in the Isthmus of Tehuantepec in Mexico, where private companies that are going to make a lot of money, a lot of money is made of wind turbines. Wind turbines are very productive and usually produce a lot more energy than is needed locally. So these are private companies that are coming into Mexico, which are major transnational companies, and they're working alongside with the Mexican government. And then we have to make decisions about where something like a wind turbine park is going to go. And these particular wind turbine parks are going in historically native indigenous lands, and particularly of the Zapotec indigenous people. And when you're dealing with indigenous people who have a long history of colonialism, where time and time again they have been on the losing end, they're very aware that every time that they have dealt with either national state governments or with colonial governments, that they've been cheated and they've come out losing. Then for them, these parks involve a political risk, right? Whenever they become involved, and whenever they have to sign contracts, they don't know if they're going to be cheated. They don't know if they're going to come out on the losing end. So there can be something that we would consider to be readily desirable and not problematic can invoke all kinds of anxieties, tensions, uncertainties for people, and people can begin to talk about what is the risk for them of being involved in this, which can frustrate people who own the companies and who run the governmental agencies, because they thought they would say, well, no, isn't this something that you would want? So this is the context under which my colleague was being skeptical of the student, because he was saying, this isn't risk. Risk is, when I think about risk, it's about environmental risk. It's about the risk that I, as a geographer, define. And here, this is the subaltern. This is the regular people defining what risk is. But I really do agree with, in this particular case, I think the graduate students had a very good point, and I supported the graduate student on her point that search and discourses, that risk itself can become a discourse, and it can become an expert discourse, and it can very easily become a form of hegemonic power. Who are the institutional agents, experts, people who can say what is a risk for whom and what is not? And what we as anthropologists provide is that through the ethnographic method, that we can document all kinds of voices that can actually be silenced. And I think that's the main point that I want to make about risk. That my colleague would say, well, risk is unique, it's one particular thing, and risk is the probability that something will occur. And as an anthropologist, I want to say that maybe risk is not the probability of what will occur. Risk is actually a context within which all kinds of voices and debates that have a lot to do with who has the power to articulate what is a risk for them comes into being, right? So for example, with the case of the nuclear power plants in Belarus, right? That for people, for policymakers in Belarus, they don't want to hear Lithuanian voices about the risks that it poses for you, especially after the experience that people in Lithuania have with Chernobyl and right? For them, this is a win-win, right? We're gonna make energy, right? And so whose voices get silenced? So risk is more about this arena of contestation within which you can have certain hegemonic voices trying to stipulate what is a risk for whom, and you can have also subaltern voices. And what anthropology brings to the table is that we can help propagate those subaltern voices that can very easily be silenced, particularly in hegemonic and state representations. Who gets to represent what the risk of a mega development project is, right? So if it's only the Mexican state that gets to represent risk, then they would say there's no risk here. This is a win-win for indigenous communities, right? But if you as an ethnographer, which other people do not do, go